welcome yet again to the Acid Trash Jamboree, and to another edition of the Prog and Psych Picks mini-series, where I focus on a few albums that can loosely be defined as progressive and/or psychedelic music. As with the last episode, the 4 albums I'm going to talk about here are all very different, despite them all being recorded in the same decade. Anyways, there's a lot to say about them, so let's crack on. Okay, so we start this video with the self-titled Sandrose album, the one and only long player from this French group, originally released in 1972. And yeah, this is very much a grower, or at least it is for me. What we have here is an oftentimes atmospheric and pleasingly melodic mixture of early symphonic prog, in the vein of King Crimson Mark I and Peter Gabriel era Genesis, mixed with some distinct, smoky, late 60s jazz clubisms, as well as stray bits of folkiness and what you might call the cornier, more dated end of psychedelia. This is all topped off with the frankly hard-to-love vocal stylings of Rose Podvuni, but more on her in a second. So yeah, the record starts well, instrumentally at least, with the tunes Vision and Never Good at Saying Goodbye, the opener being of particular note, alternating between tense, minor-keyed drama and floaty, almost easy listening lightness. Then, before we know it, we're confronted by the album's centrepiece, and probably its highlight, the hulking 11-minute long instrumental Underground session. Now, whilst this isn't anywhere near as freaked out and weird as the title would suggest, its fairly epic scope does allow for a fair amount of exploratory soloing from their Fripp and Hackett acolyte guitarist Jean-Pierre Larson and keysman Henri Garella, whose Hammond tinkling sounds like an uncanny mixture of Graham Bond and Vincent Crane. The rest of the piece is much more tightly composed, juxtaposing gorgeously pastoral, Mellotron-drenched dreamscapes against climactic moments of menace and bombast. Yeah, very nice. For me, the next tune, Old Dom is Dead, which was also released as a single, is probably the album's weakest cut. A plodding, overly repetitive dirge which gets increasingly histrionic as it drags along, with Podvuni most insufferable. Yeah, that voice. Now, I'm not sure who to even compare her to, as thankfully I've never heard another singer like her. I don't know, I guess there's also bands like Frumpy from Germany and Italy's Analogy, whose female singers I'm not so into. But yeah, I just find Podvuni's vocals uniquely grating for some reason. Then again, after changing her name to Rose Lawrence, apparently she went on to big pop success a few years later, so what do I know? Anyways, back to the songs, and yeah, the next one, To Take Him Away, is so achingly lovely, with an epic, guitar-led refrain that, in my books at least, is worthy of any of the big prog hitters, that it's hard to deny its goosebump-inducing power, in spite of the subpar vocals. As with the likes of Plastic Horizon by the Gods, and Stories by Ela Craig, I'm a sucker for these kinds of grandiose but supremely melancholic repeating refrains, and on certain days at least could probably live quite happily with any one of these playing on a continuous loop. Then, as we hit the home stretch of the LP, we find the downcast and depressive Summer Is Yonder, part moody jazz noir standard, part neo-medieval power ballad, whilst Metacara, the last proper piece here, is a perky, ever-modulating fusion instrumental, composed by Garella, though actually it's mostly a showcase for a Larson to demonstrate his nimble six-string chops. The small fragment that closes the LP is also credited to Garella, though you'd be forgiven for thinking it was an excerpt from a bizarre bit of ensemble improv. Weirdo that I am, I wouldn't have minded a full track of this stuff, but alas, 30 seconds is all we get. Okay, so that's Sandrose, who split up not too long after the album's release, though it would seem that most of the band remained very active in music afterwards, As I said, with Podvuni going on to take the European charts by storm in the early 80s. So, not the greatest prog artifact of all time. Basically, if you're a Mellotron and or Hammond organ freak, then you're going to want this. Hell, you may already have it, but yeah, for everyone else, I'd advise listening to a couple of tracks first, as the singing will most definitely be a deal breaker for most. Yeah, after my first listen a couple of years back, I was seriously considering selling it on right away. Having recently re-evaluated it for this review, I realised there's some truly glorious music on here, so in the collection it stays. Next up, we have another one album and done project, Shanti, a multicultural group based in San Francisco, who featured several Indian musicians in their lineup. And I was very surprised to learn Steve Leach on bass and vocals, better known today as Seasick Steve. This self-titled effort was recorded and released during 1971 by none other than Atlantic Records, though from what I can gather, the album didn't exactly set the world on fire. This resulted in Shanti being dropped by the label. Then, after some interest from George Harrison, rumour has it that Ravi Shankar convinced Harrison not to sign them to Apple Records, as he felt the Indian contingent of the group would be better served playing purely Indian classical music, instead of fusing it with Western rock and pop. So yeah, basically, that was the end of this extremely promising and talented group. But what about the one album they left behind? Well, it's pretty good actually. Opener, We Want to Be Free, is an ultra hippy-dippy anthem that never was, so to speak. It's heavily percussive groove, pitched somewhere between Santana and the Grateful Dead, and with a wonderfully breezy and harmonious chorus that's tinged with a yearning melancholy. Again, as with the Sandrose, we're then quickly plunged into the first of the LP's extended pieces, the 11-minute Innocence. But anyone expecting more of that fiery fusion jamming hinted at in the opening cut may find this a touch disappointing. Yeah, after an intro of subtly psychedelically treated Indian music, the full group do eventually kick in with some chirpy but ultimately rather restrained modal West Coast rock, followed by another quiet raga showcase which does eventually build up a head of steam, finally allowing the full ensemble to integrate in a more free-flowing improv context. Out of Nowhere is perhaps my favourite of the regular songs. A minor key, psychedelic lament with curious touches of medieval and madrigal music in its melody, which suddenly bursts into life in its second half with a spirited but all too brief prog raga jam. Lord, I'm Coming Round is more in the rootsy, country rock style that was so prevalent at the time, and features little in the way of contributions from the Indian musicians, though they do slot in quite nicely on the pleasant but slightly mawkish ballad Good Inside. Which brings us on to the album's longest work, the near 15-minute eponymous piece, composed by Shanti's sarod player Ashish Khan. Again, this starts in a rather restrained manner, but does pick up the pace during Khan's blistering duet with tabla man Zakir Hussain, and the ensuing rock jam, where the group finally throw off the shackles and really start to wig out. Following some nifty east-west call and response on the stringed instruments, we get the same again between the Indian percussionists and Frank Lupica's drum kit. So yeah, thankfully not your average one-dimensional drum solo, though it does perhaps go on a little too long, as these things often did. This just leaves the brief I Do Believe, a very stripped-down and melancholic acoustic ballad, which closes the record on a sweet Crosby, Stills and Nash-styled note. So yeah, a mixed bag. Not quite the Dream Team raga rock fusion album to end them all, but definitely with enough of an organic, spicy blend of styles for it to be very enjoyable. As I say, especially for fans of bands like Santana, The Grateful Dead, Traffic, and of course Quintessence. On to another San Francisco band, Shiver, a power trio from the early 70s, His work didn't actually see the light of day until much later, the year 2000 to be precise, when the Rockadelic label put out an LP of archival recordings. The vinyl album was followed by this CD the year after, which adds another 15 minutes of material to those initial 5 tracks. But yeah, unlike Shanti, Shiver were less about light and shade dynamics or intricate musical fusion, and pretty much all about tearing your face off with rock power. Yeah, almost to the point where there's nothing much else to say about them, though I'll try my best here. I mean, you just have to glance at the titles. Tough as Nails, Bone Shaker, Alpha Man, and you'll get a pretty good idea of what the band were all about. The first of these serves as the CD's call to arms, an adrenalized instrumental jam powered by Don Peck's hyperactive chimpanzee drum attack and Neil Peron's beefy bass, and overlaid with cascades of echo-heavy soloing from band leader Frank Twist. The piece kinda sounding like Manuel Göttsching sitting in with Blue Cheer. And speaking of Dickie Peterson's mob, the likes of Fixer and the aforementioned Bone Shaker would have slotted in pretty well with either of their first 2 barbarian classics, the latter also betraying a distinct Stones influence. Yeah, imagine Gimme Shelter on steroids and you'll be somewhere close. Interstellar Vision is another propulsive, jammed-out instrumental, with yet more of that tasty, echoplex lead guitar floating us up into the cosmos. Twist actually laying off the distortion pedal for a time and chucking in some rich, jazzy chord voicings, very much taken from the Hendrix songbook. Similarly, the 14.5-minute Alpha Man, originally the closer on the LP version, opens in a clean-toned zone, slowly unfurling into a Grand Funk-styled epic and eventually burning out with some thoroughly nasty space screeching, the kind that Takashi Mitsutani would have been proud of. The bonus tracks were seemingly cut at a different time and place, and aren't quite as impressive as the initial 5. As you might expect, Rocky Road and Keep On Rockin' are more on the forgettable ten-a-penny boogie rock side of things, though Up My Sleeve goes pretty hard. Some effective guitar detonations and OTT vocal frying from Twist. Then the closer, Wintertime, finds Shiver at their most reflective, with some Deep Purple meets Zeppelin strutting bluesy balladry. So yeah, not bad on the whole, but you can kinda hear why Rockadelic decided just to concentrate on those initial 5 tunes. As a recorded document, San Francisco's Shiver is admittedly pretty rough and lo-fi, sounding very much like it was recorded live in a rehearsal space or a budget studio perhaps. Yeah, the tempos are all over the place, and you can clearly hear pedals being clicked on and off, bits of unwanted feedback from the PA, as well as little fluffs and mistakes, though it's all very listenable, in spite of the odd tape dropout. But yeah, if you can't get enough of that wild, primitive, early 70s sound, then this is an essential stopping off point on your hard rock odyssey. We conclude with the second album by Shylock, another French band who, unlike everyone else discussed here today, were lucky enough to record a whopping 2 albums in their 5-year lifespan. Both of these actually came out on CBS, so another major label, though again I'm not sure that either one was necessarily a hit. So their debut, which I haven't heard yet, came out in 1977 and was followed in quick succession by this one the year after. Now, my French pronunciation is terrible, so I'm not going to embarrass myself here by saying all the track names wrong. Instead, I'll just refer to them all numerically. And yeah, straight off the bat, we're confronted by the album's 13-minute title piece, which opens with some lovely, harmonically complex neoclassical keyboard work, after which the full group enter the picture. And yeah, as with the Quella Vecchia Locanda LP I discussed a couple of videos back, you can hear straight away who Shylock have spent a lot of time listening to. King Crimson, basically. Though unlike many Crimson worship outfits, who tend to focus on one specific era of the group's discography to ape, curiously, Shylock mix up a couple during these opening stages of the record, pitting the uber-fuzzy sustain guitar and grandiose bass of the 73-74 lineup against the drummer's very best in the court of the Crimson King era Michael Giles impersonation. That said, the tune quickly opens out into a much less oppressive space. Yeah, it's almost whimsical, pastoral bounce and lightness of touch hint at the influence of the likes of Gentle Giant and perhaps Griffin even, as well as big hitters like Yes and Genesis as things wind on. Towards the end of this rather exhausting, ever-shifting statement of intent, Shylock also demonstrate they weren't averse to incorporating more commercial, populist styles of music into their sound palette, reprising the opening theme in a funky, finger-popping, space synth disco style, which works surprisingly well. By the time of the second piece, though, we're very much back in the Crimson zone. Specifically, the sinister, atonal avant-funk improvs of the aforementioned 73-74 period, over which Shylock's Axeman keeps threatening to break into fracture. The third piece, Choral, great, I can actually pronounce that one, which opens side 2 of the original vinyl, is a melancholic and rather haunting showcase for Mellotron and synths. After which it's straight back to the evil funkery for track 4, which starts off as another near Fripp rip-off, though after a nifty xylophone solo, things break off into more standard jazz fusion waters. The fifth piece, the second shortest here at just over 2 minutes, also feels rather improvisational, with shades of the dark, rocking opposition music of bands like Univers Zéro and Present. Though as with the preceding one, it's marred by some disconcerting pitch fluctuation. Though I'm not sure if this was intentional or just a flaw with the master tapes. The closer on the original LP is another dark affair, yet again worshipping at the throne of King Fripp and his magnum opus Fracture, but this time melding the influence with the aforementioned gloomy, rocking opposition sensibility. The track's tense groove eventually being completely subsumed by wild synth twittering. This CD reissue from Musea adds a fairly lengthy bonus track, which is pretty rough, sound quality-wise, compared to the preceding album tracks, but in its lovely central theme, demonstrates that Shylock were perhaps in the process of moving beyond their explicitly derivative roots into something more original. So yeah, it's a great shame we never got to hear anything more from them. Okay, so that just about does it for today. As I said last time, I'm working my way through a couple of boxes worth of this stuff, so expect plenty more in the coming weeks. If that sounds your thing, please consider hitting subscribe to be kept up to date and to support the channel. Thanks to everyone who's watched and subscribed so far, and I'll see you again soon on the Acid Trash Jamboree.